Welcome to Washington Today for Monday, December 2nd, 2024. I'm Gary Sterkoff. Thanks a lot for joining us today. The president took an action because of how politically infected these cases were. Those are the words of White House Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre as she answered questions about President Biden's pardon of his son Hunter. And the reaction to that pardon has been swift from both sides of the aisle. House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer said in a statement, quote, "Joe Biden has lied from the start." Incoming Senate Judiciary Chair Chuck Grassley said in part, quote, "I'm shocked." Meanwhile, House Oversight Democrat Greg Stanton saying, quote, "I respect President Biden, but I think he got this one wrong." We'll hear more from Karine Jean-Pierre and more reaction coming up. Congress is back this week following their Thanksgiving break. The Senate gaveled in at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. They're working on more of the president's judicial nominations. The House comes back tomorrow. On their agenda, a possible vote on whether to release the Ethics Committee's report of former Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. And of course, we are just 18 days away from the next government funding deadline when Congress must pass a new federal spending bill to avert a shutdown. And the Supreme Court heard a case today on whether the Food and Drug Administration unlawfully blocked the sale of some vaping products. The agency has denied more than 1 million applications of candy or fruit-flavored products as part of a wider crackdown, saying they appeal too much to kids. But vaping companies say the FDA unfairly disregarded arguments that those flavors can help adults quit smoking without increased risk to kids. We'll hear from the oral arguments coming up. Karine Jean-Pierre took questions from reporters aboard Air Force One as the president flew to Angola for an official visit.
You have said repeatedly yourself since the election, the president has said for months, no pardon was coming. I wanted to ask you, could those statements now be seen as lies from the American people? Is there really a credibility issue here given now this announcement?
First of all, one of the things that the president always believes is to be truthful to the American people. That is something that he always truly believes. And if you see the end of his, I assume that you've read his statement, and you look at the end of that statement, and he actually says that in the first line in the last paragraph, and respects the thinking and how the American people will actually see this in his decision making. And I would encourage everyone to read in full the president's statement. I think he lays out his thought process. He lays out how he came to this decision. He came to this decision this weekend, so let's be very clear about that. He says it himself, it's in his voice. He said he came to this decision this weekend. And he said he wrestled with this. And because he believes in the justice system, but he also believes that the war politics infected the process and led to a miscarriage of justice. This is his words. I'm just repeating what the president said. He also said that no reasonable person, if you are looking at this in a good faith way, if you are looking at the facts of Hunter's cases and you can't reach any other conclusion, right? And what we have seen, and not just us, there's other people who have commented on the president's actions in the last 24 hours. I've lost track of time, and could see that Hunter was singled out. And because his last name was Biden, because he was the president's son. That's what we saw. And so the president believed enough is enough, and the president took action. And he also believes that they tried to break his son in order to break him. That's what we saw. And this, again, I am just repeating what the president said. I think the statement in full really lays out his thought process. He said that he came to this decision this weekend, and he wrestled with it. It wasn't an easy decision to make.
In his statement yesterday, the president said that, quote, "No reasonable person who looks at the facts of Hunter's cases can reach any other conclusion than Hunter was singled out only because he is my son, and that is wrong." Now, those facts include 3 felony firearms charges from 2018. Here's more from Air Force One.
Does the president believe now and agree with President-elect Trump that the justice system has been weaponized for political purposes and that it needs root and branch reform?
No, read the president's statement. Seriously, read the president's statement. He said he believes in the Department of Justice. He does. He says it in his statement. He believes he also believes that raw politics infected the process and it led to a miscarriage of justice. He believes his son was unfairly targeted. He said that what his political opponents have done to my son, that's his words, is cruel and enough is enough. He says he believes in the justice system. And I said both things. No, but both things, well, I'm not gonna, I can only speak for this president. I'm not gonna speak for anybody else. Both things could be true, right? And that's what he says. He says that the Department of Justice, he believes in the Department of Justice. He also believes that, politics infected the process here. It infected the process. And you saw that when the deal fell apart. And let's not forget, the Department of Justice agreed on that deal. The president said if that deal had moved forward, he thought it would be a fair process. And when that deal fell apart, his political opponents took credit for it. They took credit for it and didn't seem like they were going to stop.
President-elect Trump has likened this to the case of the so-called January 6thers, the people who are in prison because of their role in January 6th. What do you think of that argument? And do you think that that's a fair parallel, that he believes he shouldn't think?
Today I'm going to talk about the pardon. We've been very clear about January 6th. The president has been clear about that. He's spoken to that many times before. What we believe in this particular case is what is unprecedented is the way that his son was singled out. And this is not the first time a president has granted a pardon before sentencing. It's not the first time a president has pardoned a family member, and it's not the first time a president has pardoned conduct that occurred during a certain time period. We've been very clear where we stand on January 6th. I don't have anything else to add.
According to the pardon's text, it applies to all offenses that Hunter Biden, quote, has committed or may have committed or taken part in during the period from January 1st, 2014 through December 1st, 2024. Hunter Biden also released a statement on Sunday. It says, quote, I have admitted and taken responsibility for my mistakes during the darkest days of my addiction, mistakes that have been exploited to publicly humiliate and shame me and my family for political sport. He goes on to say, quote, I will never take the clemency I've been given today for granted and will devote the life I have rebuilt to helping those who are still sick and suffering. Here's more Q&A between reporters and Karine Jean-Pierre.
What kind of precedent is this setting going forward for American families who, don't have the president as their dad? Is the president taking advantage of his position by doing this? Because not everyone, like I just said, has President Biden as their dad who can, do this.
Let me go back to the last thing that the president said. He said, for my entire career, I followed a simple principle, just to tell the American people the truth. They'll be fair-minded. Here's the truth. I believe in the justice system, but as I have wrestled with this, I also believe raw politics has infected this process, and it led to a miscarriage of justice. And once I made this decision this weekend, there was no sense in delaying it further. I hope Americans will understand why a father and a president will come to this decision. And as I've stated, and I read a couple of quotes from folks who said, including Eric Holder, who said if his last name was Joe Smith, this would not have happened. This would not have happened. They targeted him. Hold on, I'm answering this question. They targeted him because his last name was Biden. And again, I think the way the president ended his statement, I think clearly states where he was at, how he feels about this process, how he feels about being truthful to the American people. And so that's why he put out the statement. And we encourage everybody to really take a look about this. And the last line is, I think the American people will understand a father and a president, why a father and a president would come to this decision.
The United States has more people in prison than any country on earth. Some are facing a death penalty that the president himself said he would get rid of, has not gotten rid of. Can we expect that other people who are in prison, whose clemency petitions are sitting at the White House, are going to have their cases see the same care and attention that the president gave his own son?
So look, as you know, when it comes to the criminal justice system and really making sure we get to a place where it's equal and fair. This is a president has taken this very seriously, and you know that via executive actions that he took very early on in his administration. And he understands what certain communities go through. He's been very clear about that. He's talked about that. As it relates to pardoning or any clemency, the president, as you know, at the end of the year makes announcements. He's thinking through that process very thoroughly. There's a process in place, obviously, and so I'm not going to get ahead of the president on this, but you could expect more announcement, more pardons and clemency at the end of this term.
Reaction to the news was swift, with several members of Congress releasing statements on social media. House Oversight Committee Chair James Comer said, quote, "Joe Biden has lied from start to finish about his family's corrupt influence peddling activities. Not only has he falsely claimed that he never met with his son's foreign business associates and that his son did nothing wrong, but he also lied when he said he would not pardon Hunter Biden. The charges Hunter faced were just the tip of the iceberg in the blatant corruption that President Biden and the Biden crime family have lied about to the American people. It's unfortunate that, rather than come clean about their decades of wrongdoing, President Biden and his family continue to do everything they can to avoid accountability." House Judiciary Committee Chair Jim Jordan said, quote, "Democrats said there was nothing to our impeachment inquiry. If that's the case, why did Joe Biden just issue Hunter Biden a pardon for the very things we were inquiring about?" An incoming Senate Judiciary Chair Chuck Grassley said, quote, "I'm shocked President Biden pardoned his son Hunter because he said many, many times he wouldn't, and I believed him. Shame on me." And here's Senate Judiciary Committee member Tom Cotton earlier on Fox News.
Joe Biden, for 50 years in public office, has always pridefully boasted about his word as a Biden. And I guess we now know that his word as a Biden is trash. For months, he and his White House spokespersons promised the American people they wouldn't pardon Hunter Biden. But not only did he lie to them about that, look at the scope of the pardon. It's far beyond the offenses for which he was convicted. It's any crime he committed whatsoever for 11 years, which raises the question, what crimes does Joe Biden think his son has been committing for the last decade plus? It also raised the question of whether Joe Biden is going to pardon his brother as well, who was up to his neck in the Biden family influence peddling operation. I would ask Joe Biden to commit not to pardon his brother, but again, we now know that his word as a Biden, especially about pardons, is trash.
And here's Senate Homeland Security Committee Ranking Member Ron Johnson on Fox Business.
My guess is that Joe Biden's legacy will be, he'll go down in history as probably the worst, not only the worst president in U.S. history, but also the most corrupt. And the fact of the matter is, the media has known about his corruption literally for decades. Reporters like you have covered some of the corruption that we have exposed, but the mainstream media, by and large, has ignored it because they are complicit in the corruption. Go back to the Russian collusion hoax. They've not given back their Pulitzer Prizes for that false reporting, have they? So I don't expect, I completely agree with Kash Patel that the only way to restore integrity to these federal agencies is to expose the truth. But when we only have a few journalists, people like yourself, who are willing to highlight that truth, and the rest of the legacy media ignores it, that's going to be a difficult issue. Yeah. So again, and again, they don't want to expose it because they would be exposing their complicity and their corruption in the same problem.
Now, we've also heard from several Democrats on social media, including Greg Landsman of Ohio, who wrote, quote, "As a father, I get it. But as someone who wants people to believe in public service again, it's a setback." Colorado Governor Jared Polis wrote, quote, "While as a father I certainly understand President Biden's natural desire to help his son by pardoning him, I am disappointed that he put his family ahead of the country. This is a bad precedent that could be abused by later presidents and will sadly tarnish his reputation." He went on to say, quote, "Hunter brought the legal trouble he faced on himself, and one could sympathize with his struggles while also acknowledging that no one is above the law, not a president and not a president's son." Greg Stanton of Arizona, who sits on the House Oversight Committee, wrote, quote, "I respect President Biden, but I think he got this one wrong. This wasn't a politically motivated prosecution. Hunter committed felonies and was convicted by a jury of his peers." Jasmine Crockett of Texas, who also sits on the Oversight Committee, had a different view. Here she is on MSNBC last night.
Well, I won't pretend to speak for the entire caucus, but I will say, way to go, Joe. Let me be the first one to congratulate the president for deciding to do this, because at the end of the day, we know that we have a 34-count convicted felon that is about to walk into the White House. So for anyone that wants to clutch their pearls now because he decided that he was going to pardon his son, I would say take a look in the mirror. Because we also know that when it comes to this cabinet has more people accused of sexual assault than any incoming cabinet probably ever in the history of America. So we are living in unprecedented times, and we know that this was completely political. As someone who serves on the Oversight Committee, this was gamesmanship the entire time. And we know that this investigation had been taking place for 5 or 6 years. We know that Hunter had accepted responsibility, and it was the Oversight Committee that was pushing to try to say, no, it wasn't enough. And ultimately, the judge decided to reject the plea. And so considering everything that took place and considering where we are in this country, I say, way to go, Joe.
You can see all of the president's statement and the official text from the pardon at cspan.org. Congress is back this week following their Thanksgiving break. The Senate gaveled in at 3 p.m. today. They have votes scheduled all this week on President Biden's remaining district court nominations. Tomorrow, Senate Democrats will elect their new leaders for the 119th Congress. Here's their current leader, Chuck Schumer, on the week ahead.
We're at the beginning of what will be a very busy December. There's a lot the Senate has to do, both on the nominations and the legislative side, and not a lot of time to do them. Let me begin with the nominations. We're picking up where we left off before Thanksgiving, confirming more of the president's nominees to the bench and to federal agencies of great importance to the American people. Later this afternoon, the Senate will vote to confirm the nomination of Ann Wang to be district judge for the Central District of California. As the week progresses, members should be advised we will aim to hold additional confirmation votes on the nominees that we invoke cloture on before the Thanksgiving break. We hope to move to them as soon as possible. On the legislative side, the Senate also has a handful of priorities we must deal with before the year is out. The annual defense authorization bill, the NDAA, and the legislation to prevent a shutdown right before Christmas. On government funding, both sides are making progress negotiating on a bill that can pass the House and Senate with bipartisan support. We need to keep divisive and unnecessary provisions out of any government funding extension, or else it will get harder to pass a CR in time. For now, I'm pleased negotiations are on the right track, and I thank the appropriators in both chambers for their good work. Now, on the NDAA, I'm hopeful that we're close to beginning the process of moving a bipartisan bill through both chambers. The NDAA has been passed without fail for decades with the cooperation from both sides, and I hope this year is no exception. Few priorities matter more than providing for our national defense and taking care of our troops in uniform and their families. Finally, Senate Democrats will keep pushing to finish work on a disaster aid package to replenish the many relief programs that are dangerously low on resources. The President sent us his request last month and spelled out in very clear detail of the disastrous consequences should Congress fail to act. I remain hopeful we can get a disaster package done soon. National disasters affect red states and blue states and purple states and everything in between. We have a long tradition in this chamber of coming together when it comes to disaster aid, with very few exceptions. We should come together again at the end of the year to get disaster aid done, or we may not be ready to respond the next time Mother Nature wreaks havoc in our communities.
We heard Senator Schumer mention that defense authorization, which the House has already approved. That was also on the mind of Republican leader Mitch McConnell.
Well, the Senate has 3 weeks to complete some of the most important business of the year. And at this late hour, we'll have to act on legislation that comes to us over from the House. But let's be absolutely clear. December drama is not the way to demonstrate we're serious about our most basic governing responsibilities. With the exception of urgent supplemental assistance to states and communities hit hard about natural disasters in recent months, essential and predictable annual assignments like the NDAA and government funding are now well overdue. Our colleagues on the Armed Services Committee completed their work on the NDAA back in June. They conducted extensive hearings, considered a wide array of amendments. Thanks to the work of Ranking Member Wicker, secured an increase to top-line authorization, and they did it with bipartisan support. They handed the legislation off to the Democratic leader with months to spare. Similarly, over in the Appropriations Committee, they worked diligently to present a full-year funding bill ahead of the start of the fiscal year. I'm particularly proud of the work of committee Republicans under Vice Chair Collins' leadership to secure higher top-line funding for national defense.
The House will come back to work tomorrow at noon Eastern. Members may vote on whether to release the Ethics Committee's report of former Florida Republican Congressman Matt Gaetz. Later this week, the House will take up a bill to posthumously award a Congressional Gold Medal to the late New York Congresswoman Shirley Chisholm. She was the first African-American woman elected to Congress and to run for the Democratic Party's nomination. Of course, you can see live coverage of the House when they start work tomorrow on C-SPAN. The Senate always live on C-SPAN 2. And you can find all of our congressional coverage on our C-SPAN Now mobile app or online at cspan.org. You're listening to Washington Today.
The weekly podcast is a unique offering from C-SPAN. We tape it right here in the C-SPAN studios in beautiful downtown Capitol Hill. In the town where extremes get all the attention, this isn't more extreme opinion, it's extreme history. From what's new and happening right now, relive the history you know. So listen, follow, and enjoy the C-SPAN podcast, The Weekly. Find it wherever you get podcasts.
Welcome back to Washington Today. One of the several American citizens thought to be alive and held by Hamas terrorists in Gaza has been pronounced dead. Israeli military officials said early today that Omer Nutra was killed during the October 7th Hamas-led attacks. He was a tank platoon commander in the Israeli Defense Forces at the time. The IDF said that his body is still being held hostage in Gaza. In a statement, the Hostages and Missing Families Forum said, quote, Omer loved sports, playing soccer, basketball, and volleyball, and served as a captain of his school's sports teams. Family and friends described him as a warm, optimistic, and caring individual who lights up the room the moment he enters. Omer Nutra was 21. He grew up in Plainville, New York on Long Island. He was the grandson of Holocaust survivors. President Biden said in a statement that he is, quote, devastated and outraged to learn of Omer Nutra's death. He went on to say, quote, during this dark hour, as our nation joins Omer's parents, brother, and family in grieving this tragic loss, we pray to find strength and resilience. And to all the families of those still held hostage, we see you, we are here with you, and I will not stop working to bring your loved ones back home where they belong. The Supreme Court heard oral arguments today in FDA v. Wages and White Lion Investments, LLC. This case centers on whether the Food and Drug Administration unlawfully blocked the sale of some vaping products. Now, the agency has denied more than 1 million applications of candy and fruit-flavored products as part of a wider crackdown, saying those products appeal too much to kids. But vaping companies say the FDA unfairly disregarded arguments that those flavors can actually help adults quit smoking without increased risk to kids, and that the FDA did so by changing its standards in the middle of the approval process without adequate warning. Here's Q&A from today's oral argument between Justice Samuel Alito and Deputy U.S. Solicitor General Curtis Gannon.
Well, in the July 9 internal document, I recognize it's internal, seems to go further on the question of comparing tobacco-flavored products and the type of products that you described. It says, in particular, the evidence, this is 243 of the Joint Appendix, in particular, the evidence necessary for this evaluation would be provided by either a randomized control trial or a longitudinal cohort study. The absence of these types of studies is considered a fatal flaw, meaning any application lacking this evidence will likely receive a marketing denial order.
Yes, that is something that the July memo said. I note that even though it says fatal flaw, it says likely receive a denial order, so it wasn't even literally fatal. But that memo was withdrawn a month later. And so it did not govern the process. And the actual decision documents here make it clear that there could have been other evidence that was used to establish the thing that they knew they were trying to establish here. And that's what FDA said in its denial order. It said, you could have shown this with other evidence, but you didn't have sufficient evidence. And they criticize FDA for using what they call a check-the-box format. There was box A, do you have randomized controlled trial? No. Box B, do you have a longitudinal cohort study? No. But there was also box C, which was other evidence. So there literally was a box for anything else that they had that would satisfy the statutory criteria of being sufficient scientific evidence.
Concretely, what would fall into box C? What would be an adequate substitute for either a randomized control trial or a longitudinal cohort study?
Well, FDA in advance said it wasn't saying there's any particular thing you need. You need sufficient scientific evidence to persuade us that this is true. And what they ended up providing was a review of the scientific literature that said there are no sufficiently reliable trials that establish a connection between flavors and adult cessation with respect to cigarette smoking. And so it wouldn't have to be those particular trials. There could have been other surveys in the literature. Had there been other studies in the literature that actually established this, there was this type of evidence about unflavored e-cigarettes that was out there. But in this instance, there wasn't evidence that they needed in order to show their case that flavors are crucial to getting adults to switch.
Well, is this an adequate and accurate summary of the FDA's position? And it seems to be what you just said. You may succeed if you have a randomized control trial or a longitudinal cohort study. It's possible that you could succeed if you had something else, but we're not going to tell you concretely what that something else might be. What concretely would be an adequate substitute for either of those?
It would have to be valid scientific evidence that was sufficient to evaluate the product. That's what the statute says. That's in C5B.
The Washington Post writing today that the court, quote, appeared sympathetic to arguments that the Food and Drug Administration acted properly when it rejected applications. And NBCnews.com writing, quote, that both Justice Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett did not seem to think the FDA had meaningfully changed its position during the regulatory process. Here's more Q&A from today between Eric Heyer, the attorney for Wages and White Lion Investments, and Justice Clarence Thomas.
FDA's new longitudinal comparative efficacy requirement directly contradicts the guidance FDA provided before the submission deadline, when FDA knew that roughly 2/3 of adult ENDS users use flavored products. Before, FDA said, quote, no specific studies are required for an application. After, FDA denied applications for over 1 million products and over 250 applicants because they lacked a randomized controlled trial, a longitudinal cohort study, or some, quote, other evidence comparing the flavored ENDS products at issue against tobacco-flavored ENDS products as to cigarette reduction over time. Not a single applicant included these studies in their initial application. Before, FDA said applicants were free to select a comparator tobacco product and justify their selection. After, for flavored ENDS, only a tobacco-flavored ENDS product was an acceptable comparator. Before, FDA recommended single point-in-time studies on, quote, consumer risk perception and, quote, intentions. After, FDA concluded only longitudinal studies that track user behavior over time are robust and reliable. Before, FDA said it would make its determination based on the entire contents of the application. After, FDA admittedly did not assess anything in the applications beyond whether they contained longitudinal comparative efficacy evidence. Before, FDA said that a marketing plan was, quote, critical, necessary, and, quote, directly relevant to determining whether youth would be protected, after FDA entirely ignored the marketing plans, determining that in its experience, no marketing restrictions were adequate. FDA's denial orders suffer from multiple flaws. FDA switched its position on what studies were required, and in so doing failed to consider applicants' reliance interests in the original instructions and less drastic alternatives. It ignored the marketing plans and ignored the notice and comment process mandated by the APA and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The court should therefore affirm the judgment below. I welcome the court's questions.
You make quite a bit in your argument that FDA required certain kinds of studies at one point and then changed its mind. And yet, I'm confused as to what these studies are. What's the difference between the long-term studies and the randomized controlled trials and the longitudinal cohort studies? What's the difference, and why is that a change in FDA's requirements?
Sir, Honor, a longitudinal study could be of any duration, and that's the core. That's our core claim here. FDA didn't define long-term as being 6 months or more, and longitudinal studies are any study that tracks users over time. The randomized controlled trial and longitudinal cohort studies are two types of longitudinal studies. A randomized controlled trial will assign the user specific products, tobacco-flavored ends for one control group, whatever the subject flavored product is for another. A longitudinal cohort study has a lot of different ways to possibly design it that allow for selection of different flavors by the users, but it tracks them over time. Now, our point is what FDA said ahead of time in its guidance in the 2018 public meeting presentation is that single point in time surveys asking users of these products about their experiences, whether they would intend to use these products if they're combustible cigarette smokers, et cetera, were acceptable. Afterwards, and I point the court to page 266 of the joint appendix, FDA specifically said, based on our experience over the last 10 months, after the deadline, reviewing these applications, we've decided it must now be a longitudinal study, that single point in time studies are not sufficiently robust and reliable. That flies right in the face of what FDA said ahead of time and directly contradicts it. That misled applicants, going back to my friend's comments.
You can hear all of today's oral arguments at cspan.org and on the free C-SPAN Now mobile app. Finally, the world's largest public art project, the AIDS Memorial Quilt, was displayed for the first time yesterday on the grounds of the White House. It was part of the official observance of World AIDS Day. Here's the president.
This quilt was first displayed on the National Mall in 1987. Over the years, it made its way to the Ellipse and President Clinton's inaugural parade. Today, for the first time in our nation's history, the sections of AIDS quilts are being publicly displayed here at the White House. Because like the first threads of this quilt stretched nearly 40 years ago, stitched nearly 40 years ago, this movement is fully woven into the fabric and history of America, shining a light on the memory and the legacy of all the sisters and brothers, sons and daughters, husbands and wives, moms and dads, partners and friends who we've lost to this terrible disease. Together, we honor the spirit of resilience and the extraordinary strength of people, families, and communities affected by HIV/AIDS, including nearly 40 million people living with HIV around the world today, 40 million. And we send a clear message to the nation and to the world that we stand united in the fight against this epidemic. It matters. It matters. We reinstate that.
Also attending the event was First Lady Jill Biden, along with survivors, family members, and advocates, and Dr. Anthony Fauci, who was one of the leaders on HIV research at the National Institutes of Health. Also there, Jean White-Ginder. She is the mother of Ryan White, who contracted AIDS through a tainted blood transfusion at the age of 13 and then died at the age of 18. That was in 1990. He is also the namesake of the 1990 Ryan White Comprehensive AIDS Resources Emergency Act, or Ryan White Care Act. It's the largest federal program for treating and providing care to people with HIV. You can see all of yesterday's event on our free C-SPAN Now mobile app and at cspan.org. That's also where you can find this program as a podcast. It's also on YouTube. Just search Washington Today. And for more on the stories that are shaping Washington every day, get our daily email word for word. Just go to cspan.org/connect to subscribe. I'm Gary Sterikoff. Thanks a lot for listening today. to Washington Today.
C-SPAN's Washington Journal, our live forum involving you to discuss the latest issues in government, politics, and public policy from Washington, D.C. to across the country. Coming up Tuesday morning, Elizabeth Gaetz, Senior Director of the Brennan Center's Liberty and National Security Program, discusses President-elect Donald Trump's potential use of presidential emergency powers to facilitate mass deportations. And then columnist and economist Peter Morisi on the economic policy approaches of the incoming Trump administration. C-SPAN's Washington Journal. Join in the conversation live at 7 Eastern Tuesday morning on C-SPAN, C-SPAN Now, or online at cspan.org.